hearing from the American side for quality. So Sharad is yours, and thank you.
A research seminar is more of a survey of what we have learned from the previous problems. Especially, I'm going to focus on Japanese tsunami later on as to what happened and how they responded and recovered from that. So this is not a primary research. It's largely based on my data collection for purpose of teaching and also for purpose of doing further research. Most of the data in this comes from WTO, World Trade Organization, and UN organization called Comtrade, which collects data on a variety of export, import, and those kind of things. And the other research comes from in business journals like supply chain management and production economics and things of that nature. So, and then trade journals like Wall Street. It will be very different from the engineering outlook because I am actually looking largely at um, the business aspect. So just to give you what, from perspective of business, we look at supply chain as an aspect of sourcing of material. Supply chain people like to call themselves sourcing, procurement, and then logistics is a part of that element. And it is basically in modern supply chain networks are fairly long and complex. And that is where the large amount of problem comes from. So that is a objective from business point of view is very clear. Decrease the cost, increase the quality, and increase the reliability. What I'm going to focus on, so there are all kinds of disruptions that happen in supply chain. There are low probability, low impact disruptions, which really don't bother much. As a one-day strike somewhere or something like that, it's not going to essentially kill the supply chain. There are high probability, low impact. Again, things happen on a daily basis, a traffic delay or something like that. Those are also not very need to be studied for any purpose. There are high probability, high impact things like hurricane, things like that. They are studied in large number. Or disruption at port, disruption of bridges, disruption of roadways. Those are kind of things that they study in large number. What I'm focusing on though are the events which are low probability but high impact. And those are the ones which are not very well understood, studied, or response to them is not well, is there. And it's largely because those things don't happen that often. COVID is not something anybody could actually predict from that point of view, although there are a lot of uh, internet-based availability that people were saying for a long time. But really in business, nobody was paying attention to. So when we are looking at what literature generally considered, um, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, things of that nature, some of them are studied from how much supply chain disruption it makes and what can we do. But pandemic is or epidemics are not that well studied. There's hardly any literature, largely because this is low probability and nothing in recent memories actually come close to what COVID-19 has done. So we'll see, and this is still happening, so we don't know what the actual impact will be. Not that nobody was thinking about it. I'm sure some of you are aware of. There is a climate treaty. There is that treaty. There is also a UN framework, or what is called Sendai framework, or Sendai framework, depending upon who you ask. They are actually it's a long, about 30-page document. It was pretty interesting to read. Um, this is a major agreement where they are looking at how world as a whole should respond to disasters, and this is really a global disaster by every mechanism. I guess other than a couple of countries in the world, everybody reported cases of COVID, and they outline certain things what we should be doing. We should understand the risk, which probably in this case we had very little understanding of, or probably still have very little understanding of. Reduce the possibility and increase the resilience of the system as to they can stand. And I kind of highlighted here. Purpose of this is to reduce economic loss as well as reduce the damage to infrastructure. Of course, those are only two things this concerns directly to business, but that doesn't mean mortality doesn't affect business, or if it affects people economically, it doesn't affect business. I'm just saying that that was already in larger picture, people were thinking about it, but not in supply chain literature in general. So I went back as far as I read an entire book on Spanish flu a month ago when I agreed to do this as to what that was. And I came across a very interesting report from federal government, from Federal Reserves actually. And they did a major study on what was the economic impact. And of course, first thing they said, there's not much data collected on economics. So they're doing a large amount of analysis based on anecdotal data available. Just being terrible in terms of loss. 30, 40 million people worldwide died. 650,000 plus people died in US alone. And that's a large percentage of the population at that time. But it also showed that the recovery was very fast. Well, one should be very careful here. World War I was happening at the same time. So Spanish flu recovery and World War I recovery is kind of confounded with it. So it's not that it just happened by itself. There is no world war going on right now. So this is really purely COVID. Spanish flu was 100 years ago, world of 100 years ago, and now it's totally different. We have more global trade. We have more interdependence. Environment is very competitive. And very different that these things, the product life, for example, are so short compared to what it used to be. That affects the supply chain tremendously because it does not allow me to store parts for future use because I don't know how long part will last. So there are a lot of things that added to what has happened. And I'm not adding, there's IT, there's trade agreement, there's government regulation, all sorts of things have changed. So if you look at just from 1970 to today, world GDP, and this is important for us to see how much trade has increased, has gone from somewhere like in 71, in real numbers, about 3 trillion to about 86 trillion today. And if you look at the export has gone from virtually nothing around COVID and the Spanish flu to more than 4.4 trillion today. And these figures are 2014, and it's actually about 10% larger than that. That means export has increased about 50 times since 2013, right before the Spanish flu. These are just economic data as to how GDP has changed and how much population has changed. The exports have gone up about 10% just in 5 decades. Now, this is just a current picture, and this is again, this is taken from WTO. We are doing a current study of how COVID might affect us in terms of economics, and they're comparing from first quarter of 2014. I'm sorry, 2015. And this large dip here is during the financial crisis when merchandise trade went sharply down. This is what they expect from now on. We don't know whether this will be the case. This is the least of the effect. This is the worst effect. So somewhere here. If you look at the merchandise trade was going straight line up just before this COVID-19 hit. I'm also going to put on US and China trade just to put how much the emphasis on that. If you look at the export figures, 50%, 50+% export is actually carried out by 10 countries. There are about 200 countries in the world. These 10 countries are the major exporter of all manufactured goods. These 10 countries produce 71% of the all manufactured product. Yeah, and one might ask why I'm talking about this. This shows how concentrated is our supply chain. There's a very little diversity as far as the supply chain is concerned. If you look at China's export, which is the largest exporter, 20% of that is the United States. And very important from supply chain perspective, and this is just a separate depiction of how China's trade is going with US, and this is what China exports to US, this is what it imports, so there's a large gap. Majority of China's export are mechanical and electronic and electrical and electronics equipment. That means that these supply chain, because these things require a lot of parts. I mean, if you take your automobile, 30,000 plus parts. You take your phones, 1,000 plus parts. If you go to down every school and nurses, even more. That means you have much extended supply lines, and that causes, it's much different than if I'm selling vegetables. My supply lines are not that long. My network is much smaller. So there's a difference, and that's what accounts for most of the products exported by China. Now, so we look at some disruptions since 2000. 9/11, a tsunami happened in Indian Ocean, Katrina, Japanese tsunami. And the same year, there was a major flood in Thailand, which also caused some disruption because that's the industrial area of Thailand, which feeds to a lot of Chinese companies' basic parts. This is roughly what their damage is in terms of dollar amount. About $100 billion, which is with 9/11. Of course, there is also secondary effect because you now spend more money in security, you now more money in terror control, but direct impact was 100 billion. Indian Ocean tsunami was about 10 billion. Katrina, total loss of infrastructure is about 82 billion. Japanese tsunami was 275 billion. This was the smaller in terms of that compared to others. So Japanese in supply chain, at least business supply chain, is is the most studied disruption. And it's probably because it has a large financial damage. It had really very large impact. Most other low probability, high impact elements are very localized, and rarely impact the worldwide supply chain. But in this case, Toyota was largely impacted, and not only Toyota, even other auto manufacturers around the world were impacted. And so that's why it's probably more studied. It has more data also. The response to it was very systematic in terms of recovery. And it took some time. It took about 3 months for total recovery, but they were back in business in about 2 to 3 weeks at certain level. These are the major companies located in Fukushima area where the tsunami came. There was a large medical device manufacturer, construction equipment manufacturer. I will mispronounce their name, but Ryu, Kenki, Sengyo, Zudan, NSS, and others. This is a very special case, NSS Electronics. They made automatic controllers for all the Toyota, or large number of Toyota vehicles. And they were the single source producer. It was such a complicated product. There's only one company made them. This paint plant is also very special. They created some kind of a special auto paint, which is used by Toyota, Ford, Chrysler, GM, and several other car manufacturers. So once this paint is gone, this is the paint supposedly give a special sheen to your car. And then there are some other generic auto suppliers. So it was a large industrial area which got affected. Some was affected directly, that this infrastructure was destroyed. In some cases, infrastructure has secondary effect because they could not get power or they could not get employees and things of that nature. So these were some of the things they did. They tried to find out alternate source for their supply. And a lot of Japanese companies were moving some of their production to China because of the cost. Some have plants in Philippines, so they just wrapped up those, especially uh, medical device and construction and things of those people were able to wrap up other companies pretty well. Companies with lost power arrange alternative captive power sources within a week or two. They start wearing it. Some start sharing their design with other people who were not in their network and help them to create the products. So it took about 3 months completely to come back to pre-tsunami level in terms of production, which is a large disruption. This is what all these studies say should be done. Was missing supply chain visibility, which is how far I can see what is happening in supply chain, increase in inventory level, sourcing, diversified sourcing, increased number of people who can do the same thing. Not what happened to Toyota in terms of getting controller unit. Have better design, which can actually be easily moved to other people if possible, and have better prediction if possible of disaster. Of course, a disaster of COVID type, I'm very doubtful have a prediction model possible quickly. So let's look at in terms of supply chain visibility. Um, where are we? This is 2011. There was a survey done in 2017. less than 6% manager feels that they have a proper visibility in their supply chain. And when they talk of supply chain visibility, they're only talking their first tier supplier, that is just between here. They're not even going down to second, third, and fourth tier suppliers. Even that is only 6%. That's a very low number. And visibility means I have complete idea of what is happening to my production of my supplier, whether supplier has any difficulty in production, quality assessment, any of those things. I have complete visibility of my shipment. It's pathetic if you think in 2017 we have only 6% people who are feeling confident. So, and what it does, if you have proper visibility, you can react to any change happening. You can foresee where the problem is, even if it's a disruption, and make a change. That's very poor so far. High level of inventory. I put down this chart for you to show this is a US inventory levels, and US inventory levels are inconsistently declined. So there's no real move to increase inventory level to fight disruption. And I can understand from business point of view, inventories are very expensive. And on top of that, product cycles are going shorter and shorter. That will actually make it very difficult to justify higher inventory. So, but that solution is also not very palatable. Second sourcing, yes, people started second sourcing, but most of this moved from worldwide, but in this case, I'm talking Japan, to China. China's share in world manufacturing was 20% 5 years ago. Year and a half ago, it was almost 29%. So we did do second sourcing, but we are not moving from what if China has a problem, like COVID-19, then there is a problem because your all location is one place. So that is another thing. The thought is not just moving everything to one location. It's not really best for supply chain disruption or supply chain resilience. Design portability, again, this is a managerial decision whether you do. There's a very interesting case in business we teach, Boeing versus Airbus. Boeing had a major problem with their 737. We all know it. But nobody actually knows that A320 was also started at the same time. A320 has a very different design philosophy. They're completely modular, interchangeable parts if possible, or at least interchangeable sub-assemblies. And they were successful, whereas Boeing is still having problems, and it has not yet been approved to fly 737 again. Even after this is a actually organizational level decision. Acceptability is not 100%. As far as a standardized part is concerned, that's a little bit different because non-standard part from business point of view make a lot of money because that's where you have after sales support and spare part money coming in. So that depends on how you manage it. So if I look at the lesson status, supply chain visibility is still very poor. IT inventory level not very high. Second sourcing, locational diversity is not there. Design portability, some companies are still not following it. And disaster prediction, I'm not sure if a prediction of disaster like COVID-19 can actually be carried out. So I'm not yet whether that can be done. But, other floods and hurricanes and those, I think there's a good amount of work on those parts. Now, few risk analysis are available of this scale of disaster. Of course, none if I look at, and I actually gone through quite a bit of literature. I really didn't find much. Even on Spanish flu, there is a very limited literature when it comes to economics and impact on supply chain. One thing I repeatedly read is that the industry and the general public is very quick to forget what happened in past. And we don't have to go very far. There's hardly any lesson which we learned from tsunami, which has been mathematically and otherwise also shown that can actually improve the supply chain resilience. And nothing has been really implemented. Maybe COVID will force us to redo it. Maybe COVID will force us to reassess the sourcing and how we will look at the approach to mitigate these things. So what we need, more investment in IT. Maybe we have to rethink how we can improve the inventory level. And virtual design networks, a lot of supply chain experts are saying that we should have these networks where the capability may exist at multiple levels and multiple places to design something. If the design is virtually shared completely, so the other people can jump in if you have trouble. I read something very interesting, which I don't know, that will be my last slide, I never even know this term before. Osotua is a Maasai term which means resource sharing. And two people done a very interesting paper into how do we increase the resilience of supply chain if competitors somehow help each other during disaster. I'm sure, and they all found that the increase and that increases the reliability of supply chain. But if your competitors are willing to share the load and helping you rebuild, but that's probably not going to be a very valuable thing to do. So that's as far as my presentation is concerned. I will take any questions if there are any, or any comments if you have, which I can answer.
Thank you, Dr. Sharad, for this presentation about this theme. It surely has been challenging us all, and it is great to know that previous events may help us to mitigate, go through, and overcome this current challenge. We may now open for discussions, and you may direct your questions to Dr. Sharad. You can either speak or type in the chat, however you want. So, any questions?
I told you this is not going to be an engineering type of research, so maybe the engineers who are listening maybe have a different perspective on supply chain.
Kaza, do you have any question?
I see somebody wrote that all scenarios are based on V-shape. Do we expect U-shape? Well, that's more of a macroeconomic debate. You know, how big is the base of V depends on what you consider. If 2 quarters is like, for example, if you go back to 2008, was that a V-shaped recovery? On a chart, it looks like as if it's a V, but it was a pretty long recovery coming back to 8 level took good 4 years, 5 years. So depends on how big is the base of the we you're making. So I'm not an economic expert, but I doubt that that can be predicted right now. John, I do not know the answer to your question whether resilience is feasible on a competitive market. So one of the biggest difficulties after being not only that market is competitive, by the time you become leader in something, your product is already on decline because the product life is so short. And so I don't know what kind of incentive one can provide, but if there is a systemic understanding that a certain type of disaster only happen once in a while or at a low probability, and if there could be some kind of uh, insurance or government intervention, maybe there could be something that can be done. I don't know what incentive one can provide. I mean, maybe government can, like government has, for example, they have a strategic oil reserve. We don't have any strategic automobile reserve or strategic this reserve or that reserve. We didn't have PPE reserve enough. So if that can be done, that is one way. An incentive is there that there is enough supply, even if I'm disrupted, it can be drawn from something. But I don't know if that is possible. I'm not sure the question is mm, online suppliers like Amazon obviously reach out to supply chain. What do you mean by that? Anybody beyond the traditional Iran supply, do you see future supply demand challenges would better handle such as online business model? The online business models from supply chain point of view only doing one part. They're only cutting one element in downstream supply chain. Your upstream supply chain doesn't change. You still have uh, to procure the material, to make it. You still have people who are making parts. You still have people who are doing. So maybe a level of supply chain, one layer of supply chain or two layer of supply chain removed, but they have increased their own supply chain layers. I mean, they have uh, network of their own distribution centers, which is simply replacing distribution centers of retailers. They have their own network of third-party delivery companies or their own companies. So I don't know if online is actually reducing any structure of network as much. It's reshaping it, but not reducing complexity in any way. That's my understanding. If I can read your name correctly, GD Gupta.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Let me just read I'll read the question so that we
Okay.
can get that on the video.
Okay.
So Palmer is asking, are there any solutions that Florida can employ to both assist in today's COVID-19 challenges, as well as position the state to be a leader and gain market post-COVID-19?
This may be a question more for a bioscientist, but it's not just Florida. I think in general, one thing, and there's so little literature right now on COVID-19 and supply chain. Uh, um, that it's hard to say what people are saying, but there was one GOA report I read on how Veteran Administration is handling shortage of PPE. They just realized they have no real good inventory system. And so I don't know this Florida has enough hospital beds. That's also an inventory of a kind. Um, so I don't know. That's a tongue-in-cheek question. I really don't know the answer to how um, how can Florida handle it, and why Florida, any other state for that matter. And if the cost of handling is what happened in New York, that's a terrible cost. If you have to lose 45,000 people or so, that's a terrible cost to have. So I don't know really and that's not really a supply chain related question to me. But if you have something in there which I can answer, yes, that's my answer, Tarani.
Great. Do you have any other questions?
There is one more question somewhere on also too. I don't know. I think Charles Edwards' question.
You mean as a follow-up to also Tua? There is a
Yeah.
growing focus on collaboration. Has your other research identified this trend?
So there was a couple of papers on Japanese tsunami where there is a large scale collaboration between Toyota and other Japanese manufacturers, but not to the extent what also two papers are talking about, where actually completely taking over your production needs while you're recovering. Right. And I don't know if the way competitive markets work, the one is willing to share complete knowledge of each other's product with their competitors. So I don't know. It was an interesting concept to me. And I've never actually read that before. This was only for when I was preparing for this webinar. So I don't know. It's probably possible, but I haven't read much on the disaster response and collaboration between competitors. So there is a possibility. That's a good idea, but again, we don't live in a socialist world in some ways. That's more like a corporate socialism, and I don't know if corporations are willing to do socialism at this stage.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so since since we're moving toward the smart manufacturing and we're moving closer to the industry 4.0, how do you for future events, how do you think that AI can help to allow manufacturers and other components of the supply chain to be better prepared?
So that's a good question. Actually, there's a lot of emphasis on virtual design and computerized manufacturing as far as possible, including 3D manufacturing and AI-based systems. But you have to keep one thing in mind. Everything in supply chain cannot be automated. You still have to produce something in ground. Everything we use comes from ground or from this earth. That has to be still harvested, whether it's mining, whether it is grown in field, whether you harvest it from water or from sea or from air. That supply chain still has to be there. Yes, your production facilities may respond faster with AI, and probably in the future that will happen. But That is to be seen how quickly we adopt it. But keep this in mind: this is a double-edged sword from economics point of view. More AI takes over in manufacturing, more replacement jobs have to be found for people who are to be displaced that quickly. So, don't know. But yes, there will be a quicker response, but it cannot solve every problem. Did I answer the question? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you answered it. And I also want to add a comment. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and because I'm coming from industrial systems engineering, so to see the whole business side of the supply chain, you know, I really appreciated that.
Thank you. And that's why I told you in the beginning, I will not talk about engineering. I am an engineer, by the way, but I've not done engineering for the last 30 years. So